All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining me for How to Tuesday, how to utilize digital archives. I'm really excited that you all are here to talk a little bit about primary sources. And to talk about, how we utilize those in research, how they can be an asset to your research, and how we actually find those resources, right? Because it can be sometimes a bit of a struggle to find primary sources to utilize in our research. I'm going to put a link in the chat if you want to follow along with our workshop. I also have a whole list of links and resources that are available for you as we go through them. And that link will also be made available in the description of this video if you're watching it back on replay. So today, again, we're going to be talking about primary sources. So I want to kind of see, I think we only have a couple participants on here today, so we might skip our Zoom poll here. But I want you guys to all think about and kind of reflect on, have you ever used primary sources in your research? Have you ever found primary sources or had the desire to utilize them as you begin searching? I think that this is a really important aspect of research that often we don't talk about or teach students how to locate and find. So we're going to kind of go over today, what is a primary source and why should we be using them? And how are they different from other kinds of sources that we utilize when we're doing research? So to begin, what is a primary source? A primary source is any kind of document, object, image, or any record that provides a firsthand account or direct evidence about a topic. So I think oftentimes when we think about primary sources, the first thing we think about are letters, diaries, written accounts of historical events, right? So a really good example of this is the diary of Anne Frank, right? We have this diary that was found by Anne Frank, who is a young woman who was living during the Holocaust and was hidden away to protect herself with her family. And later, after this historical event, the Holocaust, we have found her diary and it was then published. This is one of the most famous primary sources out there. Other primary sources may include a speech, might include any kind of letter that was written, right? Any kind of material or object or document that reflects that historical event is a primary source. All right. Some more examples of primary sources that we have include memoirs or autobiographies, right? If I'm writing about my life as an autobiography, auto meaning I wrote it about myself, that's going to be a primary source, right? If a lot of times memoirs are written about a select period in time. One of my favorite memoirs is Know My Name by Chanel Miller. That's an excellent memoir that talks about a really small snippet of time. Chanel Miller is the victim of the Stanford sexual assault case. And so that is a moment in time, a really historical event that she is then addressing her personal experience of, which is a great example of a primary source. Again, diaries, things like Anne Frank's diary allows us to see a look or a reflection of a historical event. But also things like interviews, records, court hearings, any kind of written documentation is also a primary source, right? If I found a record of a house being bought, right, or land being settled, if it's an older time, maybe it was during World War II, right, that could be evidence or research that I would want to use in my paper or in my research, and that would be a primary source because it's an objective source from the historical context. Also thinking about things like photographs and archive or artifacts, excuse me. So if I have a photo of a family that lived in the 1800s, that's great. That is a photo. And that is a primary source because we can learn things from that photo based on the context around it that we may not have been able to otherwise understand, but it's from the original time period. All right. Now, a lot of times students get confused. What's the difference between a primary source and a secondary source? And the reason this can be kind of confusing is sometimes it varies by discipline, right? But as a general rule of thumb, where a primary source is a first-person account or an original account of the experience, a secondary source is often going to not be a direct observation. So whereas Anne Frank's diary was a primary source, this book by Francine Prose, which is more of a biography talking about how Anne Frank's diary survived past her lifetime, that's a secondary source because it's looking at that primary source and doing an analysis or a commentary or review of it. And again, secondary sources are works that are not based on direct observation or of evidence directly associated with the subject. This is often found in the English discipline when we think about literary criticism, right? If I'm writing an article about how Shakespeare used metaphor and imagery in his plays, that's a secondary source because I'm looking at the original Shakespeare play, the play that Shakespeare wrote, and I'm writing a commentary or criticism based on it. And so that is a really important part of distinguishing whether something is a primary source or a secondary source. Some examples of secondary sources would be a textbook, right? If you have a history textbook that's talking about World War I and World War II, that obviously that textbook editor or writer was not alive at that time, or experiencing it firsthand, but they are instead recounting the experiences of others that they've learned through primary sources, right? So it's a secondary source, similar to encyclopedias. Even if a textbook has an account, let's say they have like a printed version of Anne Frank's diary in your textbook, that doesn't mean that it's a primary source, right? Because the whole thing, when you look at the full scope of the resource, that's still a secondary source, even though it contains some primary source documents within it. Something like art criticism or literary criticism. Again, think about that Shakespeare example. Those are going to be secondary sources. Things like news articles that summarize or synthesize. That is a lot different than a news article where there's some kind of original research or original investigation done, right? If I go and I'm writing for a news article and I do an interview, let's say with Chanel Miller, that would be, a primary source. But if I just go and I find a bunch of different articles and I kind of synthesize them together to get the full story, that would be a secondary source. And like I said, this varies quite a bit by discipline, right? So like history and arts, communication, again, those primary source examples are going to be what we really typically think of as primary sources. So letters, photographs, diaries, novels, poems, speeches, thinking of like JFK and the speeches that he did, those would be primary sources. Political science, we're thinking about laws, documents, public opinion surveys. The one that kind of trips students up sometimes is the science and social sciences. What is a primary source in the social science or in the sciences like biology or chemistry or psychology or sociology? And a lot of times those primary sources are going to be research studies. If you conduct an empirical study or you conduct an original research study, that's a primary source. Whereas if you take a bunch of other resources and create, like, let's say a literature review, that would be a secondary source because you're compiling those resources and creating that through there. Thinking about the secondary sources and how those differ from primary sources is really important to understand the context around why we use primary sources. Why do we utilize them in our research? So, why do we use a primary source in our research? Why is this important? What benefit does it have to our research and to our studies? So when we think about this, we want to think about how primary sources really can add a lot of historical context to your research, right? Even if you aren't doing a history paper per se, like let's say you're in a different kind of class, you're in a political science class, you're in an English class, you're still interacting with a lot of primary source documents. And it's important to know that, you can always bring in primary source documents into your research. So if I was in an English class and I was wanting to do a paper on how metaphor is used throughout Shakespeare's works, something that might be important to pull in is more of a historical context on Shakespeare. You know, why did he use this literary device in his studies? Why is his work so renowned? Maybe you can find some primary sources on that. Maybe you can find some original texts. Whatever it is, that could be a really interesting way to add color or context to your research. It can also help us understand multiple points of view or perspective, right? If I'm doing a paper on like a national response to crisis, like our international security or cybersecurity, maybe I'm doing how the nation responds to crisis, I could look at some historical perspectives. For example, 9/11, that was a really important historical crisis for our country. So how did police respond? How did you know, people who were impacted by this respond? What kind of ramifications, what kind of laws were put into place after that, thinking about like airport security and things like that? These could all be primary source documents to help us understand. And that can also help us, you know, contrast both past and present circumstances. So again, thinking about that 9/11 example, how does 9/11 change how we do security and traveling, right? Airport security right now looks really different than it did 50 years ago, right? When you think about the airports, maybe you wanted to find some historical or primary source documents about the way that our local airport here in Kansas City, KCI or MCI, was developed. If you think about it, or if any of you have ever been there, you know, MCI was constructed way before 9/11 and was constructed in a way that didn't like account for airport security. Maybe you could find original floor plans or original news articles that are reporting on the brand new MCI airport is being built, and this is really important because it's going to make airline travel accessible to everyone. Whatever it says, you can contrast that to the airport that's being built right now in Kansas City. They're building a new airport, for those of you who don't live here. It's a very big deal. There's lots of news articles about it. It's going to be a great advancement for our airport. So you could look at the contrast between both of those, right? One had floor plans and layouts that were pre 9/11, and this one will have it afterwards. How have security measures been changing? How have the needs of Kansas Cityans or the needs of people who are traveling changed in the last, you know, 20, 30, 40 years, right? This could all be really interesting context to your research, and it helps you kind of think creatively about what kinds of topics are you interested in researching? What kinds of things are you wanting to know? And primary sources or historical documents can really help you find that. So, all right, we are going to go ahead and think about what are some different resources we can use in order to find these digital collections. So I'm going to show you guys two today that I think are really awesome online primary source resources. But if you look at our resources list, I have quite a few of them listed here. So for example, the Library of Congress has a really extensive digital collection with lots of primary source documents. So you can kind of scroll through here and see all kinds of different resources that are suggested, such as Civil War maps, from Security Administration. But if you scroll down, you'll see that there's all these kinds of collections that are divided by topic. So you could do war and military, right? Maybe you're doing a paper on Abraham Lincoln. You could do the Abraham Lincoln Papers collection, and you'll see that not only does the Library of Congress provide that resource, the primary source, it also provides a secondary source that kind of talks about the collection, right? It's talking about how the papers are from the 16th president of the United States, how it has all these documents, and it gives you some history and some resources to learn more about what these are and the historical context that they have for our country and the work that Lincoln did. So there's really great information on here, but you can also see the actual primary source documents. So you can go over here and see like Lincoln's papers, and you can read them immediately right here. The other really cool thing is that there are additional information in here, right? So like what kinds of things, this is in a series, right? There are all kinds of different titles and information about who created this. You can also scroll. So if it's multiple pages, you can scroll through the different pages and take a look at it from here. You can also download and download as a text file. So that can be awesome too if you are having trouble reading through the actual material. So we'll go back here. Another great resource is, Lincoln's first inaugural address, right? This has not only the historical address written out here, but you can also zoom in and see what mistakes were made and what he's crossed out and written above. And this is a really cool way to connect with history and get those primary source documents in a way that feels really interesting and living, right? You can see the errors made, you can see the changes made, et cetera, et cetera. Again, all the information is down below, and they even have a citation, right? It says that citations are generated from the bibliographic data. So if you wanted to cite this in APA or MLA, you could just copy and paste that citation right in there. And that's going to immensely help you as you begin to collect these primary source documents and work on them. The other resource I really would love to show you guys today is we actually have quite a lot of archival materials available on JSTOR through Park University. So if you're interested in learning more about Park's history through our archive, the Francis Fishburne Archives, we have a lot of materials digitized. We have 1,000 items already digitized and more being added every week. So this is a great way that you can learn more about Park's history if you are doing any kind of research on that. More specifically, we have almost 1,000 resources about specifically our Nisei students. So if you're interested in studying how Nisei students came to the United States and what they did here and why this was monumental for Park and for higher ed in general, you can find all of these primary source documents right here. So you can go in and select a year and see all the different kinds of resources we have available. So you can see that this one is an application for admission, right? This is a cool resource that talks about one specific student, what they did, how they learned about this, and you can download it. You can cite the citation. Again, that's a really important tool that students will want to utilize. And then you can also read more about it. This has some information about what has been written here for you to read in case, again, that handwriting is a little bit more difficult. Now, the last thing I want to show you guys, if we go back to our collection, is this is actually so through JSTOR, but specifically about JSTOR Forum. So JSTOR Forum has a lot of open access materials that you can utilize in your research. And this is a great way to learn more about history, and through all of the universities that have collaborated to bring these materials to you. So you could search here for World War I or World War II and see what resources come up. Again, all of this access is provided by Park. So if you're signed into Canvas or you're signed in through Park's My Park portal, it'll just shoot you right through and you'll be signed in to all of the resources that are available through Park's library. So this is a great resource to help you as you begin to do additional research. And I have included a link here to another library guide through UC San Diego that has lots of online primary sources, and a lot of them are open access. Some of the ones with a lock are not, but a lot of them are open access to help you as you begin to search for things. Another great link I have on here is the National Archives. This is a really powerful resource because it allows you to go through different things. So I could search for World War II. I could also do search for World War II and like propaganda, right? Propaganda was a huge part of World War II. And you can see that the series is digitized here, and you can look through the series and find all kinds of different information available. And again, this is all open access, so you can find all of this and utilize it for free on the web. You don't have to pay for it. It's all available for you. So that is actually all I have for us today. I hope that this was a helpful resource for you as you begin to think about what primary source documents are and how you can utilize them in your research.